Hello. You're so well trained and compliant. Except that was planned too, Gina. The land on which we gather is the unceded territory of the Awaswa-speaking Yupi tribe. The Moten tribal band, comprised of indigenous descendants of indigenous people taken to Mission Santa Cruz and Mission San Juan Bautista during Spanish colonization of the Central Coast, is today working hard to restore traditional stewardship practices on these lands and heal from historical trauma. Good evening. My name is Pranav Anand, and I'm the faculty director of the Humanities Institute, the research and public programming arm of the Humanities Division here at UC Santa Cruz. On behalf of the Humanities Division and the Humanities Institute, I want to welcome all of you, everyone here at the Hay Barn, and those joining us online, to tonight's Hayden V. White Distinguished Annual Lecture. The Hayden V. White Distinguished Annual Lecture Series honors the legacy and intellectual spirit of Hayden White at UC Santa Cruz. It is supported by the Thomas H. and Josephine Baird Memorial Fund. I want to thank this fund and Andrew Baird, Hayden's last PhD student in HisCon, for this generous support for the lecture series. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank the family, friends, colleagues, and students of Hayden for supporting the Hayden V. White Endowment in Historical and Cultural Theory. This endowment yearly supports a graduate student whose research connects with the intellectual tradition of Hayden White. That award and others like it are vital for promoting the kind of vanguard, silo-busting scholars Hayden himself exemplified, and it is a fitting tribute to a man who was as much known for his generous and unstinting support for young scholars. This was the person who used the research funds from his university and presidential professorships to directly support graduate students, let's remember. He was as well known for that as he was for his brilliance and wit. I've been thinking a lot about this legacy of support of Hayden's over the past month as we've witnessed the hollowing out of federal support for research, and especially over the past 2 weeks as we've seen a dramatic reduction in support for the National Endowment for the Humanities and concomitantly an assault on the most vulnerable of our community members by the state apparatus. This year marks the 25th anniversary of the Humanities Institute and the 35th anniversary of the Center for Cultural Studies, and both owe a great many debts to Hayden's administrative talents and to the flowering of HisCon that he encouraged. In Frontiers of Consciousness, his oral history of his time at UCSC, he explains that he understood that he was hired as a luminary and that could use that considerable institutional wattage to both shield and uplift those pushing the bounds of thought beyond present categories. And at that time, that included, this is his list, gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity, and indigeneity. Our division owes a great deal to Hayden for the ways he manifested his power to champion alternative models of scholarship. That legacy is at once institutionally rare and no accident personally in the case of Hayden White. It's a direct product of his fluidity of thought, his multi-perspectival abilities that allowed him to say in the preface to Metahistory that, and I quote, "The irony which informs this book is a conscious one, and it therefore represents a turning of the ironic consciousness against irony itself." When I read that the first time, I wasn't sure if he was joking or not, right? When you start a book that thick with that comment. It is that same spirit that led him to build programs and research culture that broke down silos. As he notes in Frontiers, the covetous structure of the disciplinary culture of the modern university is inherently hostile to novelty, particularly in the humanities, of which he says, "The humanities are custodial. They keep alive the things that are worth keeping alive from the past. They exercise critical judgment." It's not hard to turn from being custodial to becoming a reliquary. The counter to that potentially conservative custodial spirit for Hayden was the arts, which was creatively transgressive, and that reminder of art's transgressive power undoubtedly helped him always seek renewal, challenge, and tension over recapitulation and alignment, to live in the university while seeing outside and around it. He says, "Art, like poetry, poetic utterance, is always breaking the last set of regulations that have been put in place It's always going beyond the horizon that has been established as desirable and possible. So when I read that like a week and a half ago, and I was thinking about Fred Moten visiting, it reminded me of two things that I'd read of Fred's a while ago. The first is a famous passage from the University of Undercommons that begins, "The Maroons know something about possibility." This is the passage that goes on to say, "To be a critical academic in the university is to be against the university, and to be against the university is always to recognize it and be recognized by it, and to institute the negligence of that internal outside, that unassimilated underground, a negligence of it that is precisely, we must insist, the basis of the professions." But then I thought, maybe that's the wrong place to start. So I thought of something else, and this is from, I know that Fred isn't going to read any poetry, and I'm not going to read any of his poetry either. I wouldn't deign to. But in B. Jenkins, he has an afterward discussion with Charles Henry Rowell, and he talks about his definition of poetry. And this is in the context of him trying to understand or trying to explain to his mother what it's like to do poetry. And so this is a definition he gives. "There's a kind of pressure that music and poverty, constraint, puts on the sentence. The remainder, flight, is poetry. Over the course of history, the demands of truthful expression, as either or both correspondence and discovery, become more and more severe, but at the same time, the plain sense of things becomes more plain, and the striated polyvocality of the vessel, the medium, the conductor, strives for directness. I think poetry is what happens, or is conveyed on the outskirts of sense, on the outskirts of normative meaning. I'm trying precisely to work on that edge, and I assume that the content that is conveyed on that edge, on that fault line, is richer, deeper, and fuller than those things that are given in writing that passes for direct. That's definitely a kind of prejudice of mine, and I could be wrong. The art that always threatens the boundaries of sense has been the art that has been the most beautiful for me. With that beautiful comment, I'd like to now call to the stage my esteemed colleague, Ronaldo Wilson, Professor of Literature and Creative Writing and Director of the Creative Writing Program, to introduce our speaker tonight. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Pranav. Hello! What? We are so lucky. I'm just gonna shift I love this. Is this, Fred, is this your machine? I get to play Tetris with it up here. Okay, let's get this situated. Okay. Just move this a little so I can see my screen. Can you hear me okay? Really? Do what?
Your mouth's close to the microphone, see if you hear.
Okay, I'll shift just a little, just for you. It is an honor to be invited by THI to introduce Professor Fred Moten on the occasion of his giving our Hayden V. White Distinguished Annual Lecture, an invitation for me which is akin to being asked to steer for one moment a streamlined, steady, and vast berth of a titanic intellect out in a sea out of which streams a very small moment last night, why at dinner, where a few of us black and brown bodies in the professoriate, whether music or literature, the slippery archive, the poem, the trick, we split a self-made affogato down a middle that only existed in our ice-creamed imaginations. Class and wealth linked by the odd moment of 4 full professors just down the road, up from the impossible, and everything getting hacked and stabbed up. And we laugh instead of crying in the steaming espresso because we could cry. When? I wanted to say we can't forget at this time who we are in our studies, in what we know, in how to find the ways to balance. 'Cause Fred, for me, 'cause Fred, I wasn't weeping until I started to think, how can I introduce Fred without being in sync? And I cannot recall a time as a poet theorizing when I was not in sync with Fred's work, singular, collective, in collaboration with the steady black study of sound and substance, the objects, books of beings in philosophy, art, theory, if poetry. And in poetry, maybe most of all, where I follow his body of work. And I could say, because there are few who do in language like Fred, 'cause Fred who know ether like Nas, like Baldwin, Christian, Hooks, Clifton, Jordan, Patton, or Prince, or maybe now King Kendrick, who offer every occasion to balance and tip in the brilliance of talk, a distilled life. After Brooks, Moten heats up. The lecture, the job, slits, the executive orders, cuts into the poem, the break, the refuge under, come on. Can you hear them? They talk about us, telling their lies. It's no surprise. Can you feel it? Can you feel it? Dun, 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 dun. Can you feel it? Dun, 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 dun. Can you feel it? Can you feel it? Can you feel it? In other words, freedom. A vexed term at this moment, but what us learn from Fred is that the constraint and struggle isn't ever a localized affair. And this explosiveness from the quads up is all over we Moten bio, or I should say the biome for all you transplants and ecologists, our community of flora and fauna occupying a major habitat, e.g. forest or tundra. Fred Moten studies the social practice of poetry criticism. He lives in New York and teaches at New York University. His most recent work in collaboration with Brandon López is Revision, TAO Forms Records 2024. Fred Moten is professor in the departments of performance studies and comparative literature at New York University, where he teaches courses in Black study, poetics, and critical theory. Fred Moten, born August 18, 1962, was raised in Las Vegas, who lived briefly in Pennsylvania and Arkansas before enrolling at Harvard University. After 1 year at Harvard, he took a hiatus and went back to Las Vegas, where he worked as a janitor at the Nevada nuclear test site, read Dante, and wrote poems. His scholarly texts include The Undercommons, Fugitive Planning, and Black Study. In The Break, co-authored with Stefano Harney. In The Break, The Aesthetics of the Black Radical Tradition, The Universal Machine. In 2020, Moten was awarded a MacArthur Fellowship for creating new conceptual spaces to accommodate emerging forms of Black aesthetics, cultural production, and social life. Black and Blur is a collection of poems, All That Beauty, The Field Trio, Perennial Fashion, Presence Falling. Fred Moten works with lots of social and aesthetic study groups, including Stefano Harney and Fred Moten, the Black Arts Movement School Modality, the Mardi Gras Listening Collective, the Center for Convivial Research and Autonomy, Moved by the Motion, the Institute of Physical Sociality, and the Harris Moten Quartet. By this I mean, the state of the biome is in nature the improvisatory. An invitation into the care and study of the stealing beams of an infinite vessel of intellect that meets up with, you know how Isaac Julian is to a poet. Fred, for me, is a dancer who guides the ship and the body in all of the registers, fashion, presence, falling, to catch itself. Perhaps better explained here where Jesse McCarthy in his essay, The Low-End Theory, Fred Moten's subversive Black studies scholarship in Harvard Magazine writes, in particular, he explores how the improvisation that recurs in Black art, whether in the music of Duke Ellington and Billie Holiday, the poetry of Amiri Baraka and Nathaniel Mackey, or the conceptual art of Adrian Piper, confounds the distinctions between objects and subjects, the individual bodies, and collectively experience expressions of resistance, dire, or agony. I'll end here with two twin moves, where the biome is 'cause Fred. With train's rapid, torturous flight from one pitch, this is, of course, Fred. With train's rapid, torturous flight from one pitch to another, That accelerated ascent and descent of the scale that he performs at the end of the solo, one is always struck. No, one is always stricken. By the way he glides, Amiri Baraka once said of John Tikakai that he slides away from the proposed, but this gliding is rough, tossed, rolled by water, flung by waves. There's a kind of obscurity, even a kind of madness in Train's glissament, his glissando. This opacity of gliding is choreographic. Philosophy thinking on the move, over the edge, an exhaustive imaginary mapping of an underworld and its baroque and broken surfaces. This from his essay, Meditation on Edouard Glissant, to consent not to be a single being. Glissement, glissant, glissando, animating what Moten seizes in dancing with Glissant's notion of the unknown. Moten, which Fred cuts into air arms, into an unknown that, quote, bears a nonviolent, unavoidably overturning, a contrapunctal swerve, a voluntary submergence, way of the outskirts of ascent. Why? Because Fred, Self, that motherfucker, said, we write what we don't have to write together. We never want to take our solemn pleasure. We write together like we don't. So what we write is barely born. Self said that shit like he was sad, why we act like we ain't a band. Soul said, see that? Rob Brown just saw Kid Jordan sound like Daniel Carter lifted by the air he breathes. Lifted out of self like soul at visiting. Soul smiled, visiting our ass off is how we grind and underbreathe off edge and ground and fly. Look here now. Here we go, Sylph said. In ruins, though, I welcome now to the stage the wonder dancer, inimitable, and always here, Fred Moten.
Thank you. I really don't know. I'm very grateful to be here. I want to thank the Humanities Institute in Pranav. I want to thank Maya. I want to thank all my friends here, James, Gina, my friend that I just, well, we met, really. Fahima, whoever else is here that I just haven't seen yet. And Ronaldo. Yeah, thank you. So when it's such a, I have had the good fortune of having really great mentors, one of whom was Masao Miyoshi. And the only time that I ever met Hayden White, it was Masao Miyoshi who introduced us, I think, at an MLA years ago. And I think it really means a lot to me to give this lecture in his name, and I appreciate that very much. And I wanna, it means so much to me, in fact, that it put me in a certain kind of trouble, which I have been spending the last few years trying to avoid, and I'm already deep in trouble now. I don't, my capacity to lecture in that sense of standing in front of people and reading something that I've written has really deteriorated over the course of the last few years. It just feels so weird and unnatural. partly because I don't think that most of what I write, at least in prose, is really meant to be read aloud. Rather, it's in preparation for talking with people. So what I end up doing all the time is I start to read and I get caught in this feeling of nobody knows what's going on here, and I barely know myself. And so I interrupt myself and say, well, what I mean is this. And it just takes forever. And so I had gotten to the point where I felt like, well, and that's one part of it. Second part of it is that it wasn't that my writing had somehow lagged behind the thinking, but in keeping up with the thinking, it had changed its form so much that, again, it made it harder to see that anything was going to actually be conveyed, at least in that immediate way. And it freaks you out a little bit because I got the feeling that I was constantly sort of giving the impression of a lack of preparation. And so I wanted to read something that seemed prepared today. And I did, I prepared something. And here's the problem, which is I used to do this thing where it's kind of a Wallace Stevens kind of thing where I would think of a title, partly because it was something I was kind of ruminating on, but I would think of the title before I worked on the thing, And I realized, and so I'd fallen into that habit. So Bernard asked me, what's the title? I was like, Theory and Practice of Contradiction. And here's the problem. Theory and Practice of Contradiction is actually like a way of describing what I've been trying to think about for 40 years. So there's no way that I was going to be able to give you something called Theory and Practice of Contradiction in 45 minutes. The only way that I could begin to enter into that well, let's put it this way. The only way that I would have been able to begin to tell you the story of how it is that I've been thinking about theory and practice of contradiction would have been to violate the way that I've been thinking about theory and practice of contradiction, because the way that I have been thinking about it has been within the framework of not only a resistance to a certain notion of objective historiography in the spirit of Hayden White, but even in a kind of tension with the imperatives of implotment. And I'm going to try to say something about that in a minute. I'm not obviously going to read what I had prepared, but I can send it to you if you want. But I will refer to it. So I had to break you off a piece of the theory of and practice of contradiction. And the piece that I broke off for y'all is called The Poetics of the Intraview. Okay. And I feel bad about not reading it, because it feels prepared. But like I said, I'm happy to share it with you. But I'm hoping that this will be okay. Okay. So what I want to do is, instead of telling a story about my concern with the theory and practice of contradiction, I want to give a few I want to give some excerpts that in a certain sense go against the grain, okay, of a kind of normative understanding of emplotment. They're, which is to say they not only operate outside of a sort of, normative temporal progression, but they also, they're so all over the place that they actually constitute an example of something that we might call all over the placelessness. So here we go. There was a phrase, something that Cedric Robinson used to always say that I am fascinated with, and I share this fascination with my friend Stefano Harney, and we talk about it all the time. Cedric Robinson would say, we have to deepen the contradictions. And then every once in a while he would say, we have to heighten the contradictions, okay? This interplay of deepening and heightening implies a kind of active verticality, a kind of practical rise and fall that if you keep messing around with it, it not only indicates a kind of verticality, but I think a certain cyclonic verticality. There's a spiral thing going on in this movement. Up and down twists in a certain way. There's a torque to this heightening and deepening. And that torque is corrosive. It's corrosive of any possible settlement. It's corrosive of resolution. Okay? And it's important that this is both an intellectual imperative and as well as a social imperative. Okay? The way I think about it sometimes is like, has anybody ever had the occasion to use a post hole digger? Right? That thing where but it's, this is something that, that tool produces, the way that it has to work, the way that it can work is that at the same time as you're plunging that tool into the earth, you're also twisting the tool, right? Okay. But that interaction of plunging and twisting, and my friend and my tutor, Karen Barad is not here tonight because they're somewhere out there. But when I say intra-action, right? As a Orthodox Baradian, okay? And I'll try to, okay, say something more about that. Okay. What that twisting and digging, it's a practice of, it corresponds with certain practices of cultivation. The word I kind of want to half make up for it is occultivation. This digging and twisting. You can do it with a post hole digger, but you can also do it with your finger. It's even better then. Planting something, I think it generally requires that torqued, verticality. It's really deep because it has something to do, it becomes really intense when what's at stake is how you put your hands in the ground. One could also think about it in relation to diving, right? Like if you ever watch diving in the Olympics, people seem to only ever watch it every 4 years, but it becomes fascinating as if you had never seen it before every 4 years. And one of the most fascinating things about it is the way in which the verticality of the diver as they enter into the water is a function of a kind of torque or twist that they have to do with the part of their body that's already in the water, right? So this twisting verticality, right? this corrosive, ruptural sort of up and down movement is, I feel like that's what Cedric Robinson was trying to tell us, trying to say, right? Trying to give us as a kind of imperative, okay? So that's a practice of contradiction, okay? And that practice of contradiction seems in a kind of interesting way to contradict most of our general theories of contradiction, which turn out not to have a whole lot of torque in them and not to have a whole lot of verticality in them, right? There's a sense of a kind of horizontal standoff, right? Okay, so a sharp pivot, too, but they're connected, right? This is the all over the placelessness, right? The non-locality of the theory and practice of contradiction, okay? The low-end theory. I finally realized where that comes from in class yesterday. I'm teaching a class called Performance and Technology. And I guess the subtitle of it is The Philosophy of Percussion. And a key figure for us, sort of two key figures in the class are Walter Benjamin and Jay Dilla. So there's this great little 10 or 12 minute video on YouTube that you can watch, and the title is something like How Jay Dilla Humanized the MC3 Machine, right? This sort of, just machine made by Akai that basically has this sort of tremendous, it looks like an adding machine, but what it really is this tremendous anthology, which one could also call a bouquet of beats and of possible rhythms. And what Jay Dilla does is he does a couple of things that are unique as an artist. One is there's a kind of tendency to think about rhythm in terms of regularity. Jay Dilla always understood, because he was a student and practitioner of black music, that rhythm is about irregularity. Okay? And so one of the things that Jay Dilla does is he disconnects a function that this beat machine actually has. The function is to quantize, right? There's a sort of auto-correct feature in the machine that will take necessarily imperfect and irregular human beat making and regularize it, right? Create a kind of absolute sort of regular interval, right? He turns that part of the machine off, okay? So that with Jay Dilla's rhythms, you are always about to fly off the handle, okay? There's this constant interplay of acceleration and retardation. And you never lose the groove, because that's where the groove actually is. Not in regularity, but in irregularity. What Jay Dilla does rhythmically is kind of like what Ray Charles does with notes, right? To listen to Ray Charles sing is to listen to a note that is always in the process of this extraordinarily generative decay, right? His notes go off, right? They never quite get where they were supposed to go, right? So this is an exercise in displacement. And the point, the other thing that Dilla does that's also extraordinary, and here's where contradiction comes back into play in a real emphatic way, though it never left, is what he does is he'll take a beat, right, a drum beat, and he's got that kind of amazing ear that allows him to hear the tonal range of the beat, right? He recognizes also that the beat is a tone and a note. And the low end theory, literally, which was the title of a great album by A Tribe Called Quest that Jesse was referring to. But the low end theory, which was an album that was largely produced by Jay Dilla, refers to the way in which Dilla will take the top edge off the note of a beat, producing this sort of weird, almost like dampening effect, right? So instead of that sort of high, tinny, sharpy kind of edge to a beat, you just get what he calls the low end of the beat. Now, again, this is a practice, it seems to me, of verticality and twisting. But the reason why I wanted to bring it up is because what's important is that Jay Dilla has this capacity to hear a difference internal to the note, a difference internal to the tone, a difference internal to the beat. And that difference is not only a sonic difference, but it's a temporal difference too, right? So why does this have to do with contradiction? I want to make up a new word, but I don't even know if it is a new word. It might be an old word. I looked it up, but there was no information on it. And the information that was on it, I couldn't understand it. Right? It seemed to not be a word as much as it indicated a certain kind of grammatical option in Latin. The word I'm thinking of is contradictum. Okay? What I'm interested in is a word in which the internal difference of the word, right, becomes palpable and evident. Okay? Sometimes it plays itself out at the level of a kind of semantic internal differentiation, which only emerges by way of repeated, rigorous attempts to define it. Okay? So one possible mode of a contradictum would be like the word atom. Okay? Right? That the internal contradiction of the word atom comes into play after 2,500 years of physics attempting to find it and never finding it, right? So that you have this massive amount of intellectual work which is predicated on an idea, right? But the actual physical reality that would correspond to the idea can never really actually be observationally established. So for instance, if you ever try to read Richard Feynman's lectures on physics, it sort of begins with this great formulation. He says, well, if there was some catastrophic event and we lost all of our knowledge of the material world and we had to rebuild it, where would be a good, simple place to start? And he says a good, simple place to start would be that that things in the world are made up of atoms, and that these things, these atoms, are structured in such a way that they have this tendency to coalesce under certain kinds of pressure and to disperse under other kinds of pressure, right? This movement of dispersion and collection, of gathering and dispersal, right? So when he then tries to define atom, what he says is something like, an atom is an excitation of the field, right? What David Bohm, another great physicist, said is, an atom is an ill-defined cloud. So for me, the notion of the contradictum with regard to atom is, at the same time that we want to think of atom as an absolute and indivisible fundamental particle, the people who seem to know the most about atoms and who have spent all of their lives trying to actually define it as dispersal, right? Rather than as this, right, irreducible tightness, okay? So that's why I think of the word atom as a contradictum, right? The word, once we dig into it, once we start to think about it, it undermines its own semantic content, right? Okay. But here's another kind of contradictum, okay? And this gets me back to the other thing that happened today. So the thing that happened just now that made me completely give up the idea of doing the prepared talk was low-end theory. Okay. The other thing, I didn't notice was happening at the time. I got on a plane at 6 o'clock this morning and I was like, well, what should I do? Should I try to sleep? Should I try to write? And I said, no, I'll just watch a movie. So I watched two movies. I watched The Complete Unknown, which is really all about the dispersal of the atom. It's just, at a certain point, Dylan just wanted to be in a band, right? He just didn't want to be up there by himself, lecturing, right? And then the other movie I watched was The Return, which was so bad it went straight to the plane, right? Like, no one's seen it, right? It's Ralph Fiennes and Juliette Binoche. Like, it's supposed to be good, but they forgot to write it, right? It's like, so it's got that weird kind of matter-of-fact, anti-literary tone that a lot of translations of Greek drama have, you know, where they kind of they forget the poetry, like they don't want to do the poetry. So it's like that, and and they're like trying really hard, you know, they're trying really hard, okay? But I was like, so I'm sitting there and I'm thinking about Hayden White, and I'm thinking about the way that meta history wants to not just refuse the delusion of objective historiography, but to displace it with another possibility, not just the possibilities that are given in the necessity of implotment and narrative, but rather possibilities of a kind of animplotment or disimplotment that could be said to occur within the framework of what we might call experimental narrative in the 20th century, right? It was never just about, right, the revelation of the fundamental narrativity of history. It was like history should be experimental narrative too, right? It should disrupt not just the normative conception of plot, but it should also disrupt a whole range of possible modalities of human existence which are predicated on that notion of plot, right? Which is to say, predicated on a notion of spatiotemporal constituency that ultimately requires something like what we might call settlement. That was quick and fast, and I can come back to that in the Q&A if anybody wants. Imagine, right, you know, in other words, there's a kind of experimental narrativity which is, in some sense, undriven by the desire to have a place and time in the universe, right? There's a homelessness to it, as Fahima would say, right? Okay. And the whole question is, right, you know, how do we accept the ethical imperative to desire and then to claim that homelessness, right? As something which is antithetical to the desire to settle, right? Okay. This is a problematic of anti-coloniality, right? And I'm coming to that. Matter of fact, I'm coming to it right now, okay? So The Return is the story of Odysseus, right? So it's the story is Odysseus finally gets back to Ithaca, right? And so it's this sort of 2-hour dramatization of how he gets his kingdom back, okay? Of course, the other word, you know, the other name that we give to Odysseus is Ulysses. And Ulysses is obviously a touchstone in the development of experimental narration in the 20th century. And my brain kind of went to Joyce. But then when I got here in this building just a few minutes ago, I realized that the reason that I had watched The Return is because I was getting ready to meet Gina Athena Ulysses, right? Because the Lord moves in mysterious ways, okay? In his all over the placelessness. his inveterate, or their, let's say, their inveterate non-locality. Okay, here's the other place where contradiction comes into play. Okay, and this is something that I've been thinking about, and especially thinking hard with Stefano for 10 years, okay? Under the influence of two texts. One is an extraordinary collection of speeches and literary criticism and essays by Andaya, collected and edited by, oh man, I'm getting old. I can see her face, and we email all the time. She's at the University of Toronto. Trotz. Elisa Trotz. Right? From the completely impossible entity called Guyana. Like the two greatest mysteries in 20th century culture are Guyana and Birmingham, Alabama. How did so much shit come from these, you know, but that's another lecture, I suppose. The other contradictum that I want to put forward is betrayal. The way that it comes is in this way. Andaya was a confidant and a special friend of George Lamming. She gives an extraordinarily beautiful reading of Lamming's work. She actually edited two of the collections of Lamming's essays and interviews. She writes beautifully about In the Castle of My Skin. And the question that emerges with regard to Lamming also comes by way of Chinua Achebe. And what she says is, basically, how is it that those whom we have nurtured and sacrificed into power, how is it that they are the ones who give more aid and comfort to our enemies than they do to us? Okay. It's a beautiful formulation, and I used to try to turn it into like a pseudo-mathematical equation, and it went something like this. How is it that anti-colonial desire, by way of decolonial means, becomes responsible for the post-colonial administration of anti-coloniality? Okay. Betrayal is a beautiful way of putting in one word that equation. But it does so by way of a beautiful operation in which we see the interplay of the low end and the high end of betrayal. How is it that those whom we nurture and sacrifice into power, we nurtured them and we sacrificed for them so that they could come into power? On the one hand. On the other hand, we nurtured them and we sacrificed them to power. We sent them to Oxford, right, from Trinidad and from Barbados. My mom sent me to Harvard from Las Vegas. And when I get a chance to talk to her again, I got one, Mama, did you know? You know, why did you send me, you know, up there with them people? But you know, because I couldn't go back, you see, right? So you understand this double edge of betrayal, right? Okay, which allows us and requires us to take the tragedy of post-coloniality and turn it into something that is not a recapitulation of the metaphysical terms of order that generate that tragedy in the first place. The fundamental metaphysical term of order that generates, right, that tragedy is the assumption of individuation, of what Cedric Robinson calls organistic integrity, right? we send the one, the avatar, who's supposed to save us, and they never do, right? We sacrifice that one to power, and then we wonder why, okay? And the easy way out is to produce a narrative that says that that failing, right, is a failure of individual morality. But what Andaya is saying is no, right? It's a problem that's at the heart of the metaphysical foundations of political theory, okay? It's a contradiction at the heart, right, of a certain notion of, you know, of what one might call the Republican essence, right, of a certain kind of anti-colonial desire, okay? All right. How is it that we will be represented? How is it that we will come to be one, but also how is it that we will come to be a collection of ones? How is it that our freedom, which can only ever be given in our individuation, right? How is it that we can we formulate a state that will protect that freedom? Yeah, the only way that you can do that, though, is the way that states have always protected the freedom of certain individuals, by denying the freedom of others, right? Right. So this is part of that contradictory force. Okay. So for me, the question of heightening and deepening contradiction, that torqued verticality, that digging, that diving, that sounding, right? And it makes me think of another Hayden White formulation, a beautiful essay, historiography to, what is it? I can't say the word right, but historiography to historiophaty. And I kind of want to think, what if we came up with something like historiopolyphony, right? That's what the contradictum potentially gives us, right? Okay. The word, like an atom, disperses and gathers, right? And the way that it disperses and gathers, the way that it is internally differentiated does seem to me to be vertical in this regard, that each of those semantic layers is like on top of another, right? It's palimpsestic, right? Okay. It's not that the palimpsest is opposed to seriality, but somehow then we have to come to grips with a kind of palimpsestic seriality that is given in these words that we can sometimes use, not only to better describe what it is that we have been doing, but to give us a kind of inkling about what it is that we can be doing. Okay. So really, truly, for the last however many, a long time, this is what I've been trying to study, okay? This palimpsestic, torqued verticality, the way that the word is in some sense really better understood as a layering of itself. The word, like sort of the French pastriness of the word, so to speak, right? You know, and what it means to dig, what it means to dive, what it means to sound, right? Those layers, right? But in a twisting, corrosive, grainy kind of way that doesn't leave any of those semantic layers untouched, but rather is constantly rubbing them as if they were strings, and will not leave them intact, and refuses any sense of their organistic integrity, any sense of their semantic determination, right? That this practice of contradiction, which we can associate with reading, okay, is also a practice that we have to associate with our social practices, with our social activity. They're not separate from one another. So, one last bit, and then I'll stop. The part that I had prepared is the poetics of the interview. And there's two parts to it. One was about an interview that never happened. But the interview that never happened was going to be primarily focused on the practice of interviewing. I was supposed to interview Nikki Giovanni in November at Florida State, but the hurricanes came, and turns out she was much sicker than anybody ever that we knew, and it didn't happen. Okay. But there's this beautiful way in which, if you look at interviews of Nikki Giovanni on YouTube or whatever, what you see, well, I'll come back to it in a second. The other interview was an interview between Robert Christman, the late great editor of The Black Scholar, and the great Cuban poet Nicolas Guillen. And what I noticed in this interview is that just this very real, rich sense in which there were always more than two people in the room, right? It was not only, so this is the other element of the right? So one part of the contradictum, like I said, is that kind of thing where there's this thing that you think of as one thing, and it turns out to be a whole bunch of things. Like it's joined, there's a multitude, a rassemblage, so to speak, right? Like a complication, okay? An uncountability, right? Okay. And then there is this, so there's always more than one. And then at the same time, there's always somehow less than one. That the entity that you thought of as one, in their interaction with another, turns out to be less than itself too, right? This double indeterminacy is, again, part of what I'm interested in with regard to the contradictum. And that indeterminacy as the condition of possibility of interaction is, again, that's a Karen Barad formulation, right? So really, the poetics of the interview is a special case of the more general problematic of the theory and practice of contradiction. Okay. And I had prepared the poetics of the interview, and I'm still preparing the theory and practice of contradiction. So I hope I've been able to convince you that I wasn't just, that even though I was totally just playing around, I wasn't just playing around. You know, I've been working, you know. As your old friend and mine, Nathaniel Mackey, would say, I worked it down to a nub. Or on the other hand, you could say I worked it up to a dub. Anyway, I think that's probably just about my 45 minutes. Thank you very much. Now, the interview portion of the evening. Any questions? Oh.
Thank you, Fred. Have you heard of the no-state solution?
The book?
No.
Or the general idea?
Not the book, the general idea.
Yes.
The book, which doesn't include any Palestinian thinkers about the no-state solution. What you have remarked on has really struck me many years ago, you renamed an essay I wrote about resignation, and I think you just renamed another one in thinking about return, but also the problem of forming a collection of ones. And you really brought to mind, for me, Palestinian thinking about the no-state solution, which is, how do we imagine returning only to construct the very structure that displaced us in the first place? And it brought to mind really also the impossibility of return in another sense, which is, how do we return to what is now uninhabitable in many senses? And I don't know if that's necessarily a contradictum, if Palestine, the idea of it is a contradictum. And I didn't really want to talk about Palestine, but you really prompted this for me, thinking about the palimpsest of Palestinian land itself, Palestinians beneath the land, on top of it, underneath rubble, on top of it, and so on. And so I guess I'm curious, because of your long thought about Palestine and Black study, which has been so instructive for us, and my students today are reading George Lamming, and thinking also about how he realized he was West Indian once he made it to London. I suppose I'm curious to hear, or maybe hear you think aloud, or sing, if you prefer, more on the palimpsest and placelessness, or I guess out of placelessness, which I'm tempted by as a Palestinian and a Black studies scholar, to think of Palestinianness as necessarily out of placelessness. And that is not a condemnation or a rejection of our return, but that return is something else entirely.
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. I mean, but I feel like you asked and answered, at the same time. So I don't know if I can answer it, but I can add to it maybe, This, it makes you consider that that there is we ought not ever question the legitimacy of a right to return. But the right to return, the exercise of the right to return is catastrophic, right? Really, truly, that's, actually, maybe this movie wasn't so bad, because there's one point where, Binoche, who plays, I forget Odysseus' Penelope, and she's like, basically, Odysseus kills everybody, right, who's there, right? And she's like, my house is a slaughterhouse, right? Okay. So this, and I'm not trying to make light of it. Because here's the thing. Why is it that the most thoroughly and brutally oppressed people have to also be burdened with the ethical responsibility to refuse the right to return? It's not fair, okay? Why is it that the people who have not only been excluded from citizenship, but who have had citizenship literally, built on their backs, why is it that they have the ethical responsibility to refuse what has been refused to them? We can ask this question. We ought to never stop asking the question. But we don't ask the question because we don't know the answer, right? We know, right? Well, what's at stake is like a deep and something almost like kind of like cosmic unfairness. And it turns out that justice is all bound up, right, with the practice of this cosmic unfairness, you know? I mean, I know he was supposed to be all great and all, and I never took his class, but people told me that I was supposed to. But I always thought that John Rawls' notion of justice as fairness was just childish. You know, any of y'all have kids, you know. It's like when your kids say it's not fair. You're like, no, it's not fair. You know, you just don't get everything that your brother gets, and here's why, you know, and it's not fair. I know you don't like it, it is not fair. But if I did something different, it would be unjust, right? This is, you know, so, right? And this is, you know, I do want to say, I want to put in, okay, here's another unfairness. And it's, because here's the thing, right? It's uninhabitable and people live there, and it's been uninhabitable. These, again, that's a practice of contradiction, and they deepen and heighten it, right? No attempt to resolve, right? This is, in matter of fact, anti-colonial struggle is in the deepening and heightening of that contradiction, right? Like the primary modality of anti-colonial struggle in Palestine is to continue to breathe, right? Right, just, you know. So this, you know, and every Palestinian breath, right, shows up for the nation state of Israel as an act of terror. And, you know, okay. So the reason that I would then want to, you know, and the Boyarin brothers are my friends, right? And I've learned a lot from them. And I trust in and believe in their ethical commitments. And the no-state solution is really not about Palestine, it's about Israel, right? And the book probably would have been better if they had included Palestinian voices, but at the same time, it's absolutely crucial and important that it is two Jewish voices who are saying that the solution to the problem of Israel is no state. You see what I'm saying? Like, and that's a separate question from the question of peace in the Middle, right? There's a notion, well, peace in the Middle East is a two-state solution or a one-state solution or no state. No, they're talking about the solution to the problem of Israel, right? It's deep, okay? Because sorry, this just makes me want to ramble, you know? I don't know. I'm stupid and I say a bunch of shit but I don't care. I mean, like, I went to this big conference up in Toronto. That's where I just saw Alyssa, you know? And it was like, you know, a conference on anti-Zionism that was supposed to happen at Princeton, but Princeton wouldn't give any money for it. So it got shifted to the University of Toronto. Yeah, right. And, you know, Daniel Boyarin gives a talk. He says this kind of amazing thing, you know, he says, I'm a Jew, and therefore he says this, and he says this in the book, I'm a Jew, and therefore I'm a Zionist. But the kind of Zionist I am is that I'm an anti-Zionist, right? He's struggling. This is a pretty deep formulation. His brother Jonathan just laughs when he says it. He calls it Daniel's shtick, right? But the point that's interesting to me about it is I kept thinking to myself, I have trouble calling myself an anti-Zionist for a couple reasons. One has to do just with the still fresh historical catastrophe of the Shoah, right? And one has to do with my notion of the early history of Zionism, which is much less about returning as it is about getting the fuck out of here, right? Like, let's get the fuck out of Russia, right? Like, that's how it shows up on the most, you know. Then it becomes about return, okay? And you know, with the abundant help, right, of European coloniality, okay? And it folds itself into that project seamlessly, okay? But the main reason I can't call myself an anti-Zionist is because of Curtis Mayfield and Bob Marley. Like, I kind of feel like I'm a Bob Marley Zionist, right? Because Zion Train, it ain't about returning, it's about getting the fuck out of here. The Zion Train is coming here, you know, get your ticket, get on board. There's no question about where you're gonna go. You're just getting out of here, right? Right? In other words, it's an active call or prayer for displacement. Okay. But I have no problem whatsoever calling myself anti-Israeli. I'm anti-Israel. You see what I'm saying? Like, I'm not anti-Zionist. You know, which is funny, right? Because at NYU, you know, just for a minute, I can stand up in class and say I'm anti-Israel. But as long as I don't say I'm anti-Zionist, I don't have some person coming to mess with me. But you know, it's a loophole. It's a loophole of retreat, you know. You know, because I'm anti-state, right? I'm interested in the generality of the no-state solution, which is, again, an active call for displacement. It's a practice of heightening and deepening and twisting, right? Contradiction. That's, you know, where contradiction, one other way of thinking about contradiction is as a kind of absolute inconsistency, right? So anyway, that's just my addendum rather than answer to the beautiful question. So thank you. Oh, James, my man.
I'm going to try to formulate a question from what I'm understanding about what you're talking about. Relative to the idea of palimpsestic torqued verticality, along with the deepen, heighten contradictions, I've been thinking about how this idea of non-resolution, you know, because I'm often, you know, this along with sort of the destruction of any sense of tonality in music in terms of a hierarchical relationship between areas. And you've helped me realize that what I've been thinking about is actually non-locality within the idea of music. And how I often you know, talk about in my theory classes, I'm interested in the functionality and non-functionality. And to not resolve is actually the point of resolution. But as I was thinking about artists. I mean, you were talking about Jay Dilla, who I also love, but I was thinking about Bilal and Abby Lincoln and Andrew Hill. Could you talk about your ideas within the context of these? I mean, it could be anybody. They just came to my mind. The sort of non-resolution, the sort of naked bearing of one's innerness to express something higher than higher than themselves, and pointing to that collective.
So I'm gonna try to come at it it's gonna be a little bit of a roundabout way. Like, this is a great interview with Derrida, and I think Derek Attridge. It's in his book called Acts of Literature. And Derrida says something like, everything is in Shakespeare, right? So a similar formulation would be something like, all of it is in Baldwin, okay? Like, so I'm thinking of Sonny's Blues, and I'm thinking of, and you could probably, tell me a whole bunch of different variations on this theme, but Sonny starts out as a drummer and then becomes a pianist. So another variation on that would be like Lionel Hampton, from drummer to vibroharp, okay? But Dilla, right? Because there's all this, because it turns out that Dilla's beats have all this harmonic and melodic complexity and richness, right? Okay? And so it lets you know that that what is often degraded or devalued, in Afro-diasporic music, namely this percussiveness, because somehow we associate, first of all, we've decided to value development and its interplay of individuation and implantment, and then we say that there's some kind of richness, right, in Western music and in its harmonic complexity that this other music doesn't have. It's like, no, but it's all over the place. Like you say, that non-locality, right? I mean, like Blakey, just dropping bombs. The way certain, like, have you ever listened to just that album Coltrane Time? But it's also called Hard Driving Jazz because sometimes they list Cecil Taylor as the leader and sometimes they list Coltrane as the leader. But Cecil's comping, it's like, right? Like this, like some kind of anarchic pointillism or something, right? And okay, so what's going on there? And and they're playing like Just Friends, and that song is. Okay, so Charles Rosen, great pianist and musicologist, wrote this really cool little book on Schoenberg. It's just called Arnold Schoenberg. And he gives this great definition of dissonance, like the one that for me is like the most clear. He says, because usually people associate dissonance strictly with discord, right? But for he says that for Schoenberg, a dissonant note. So first of all, he makes this really cool conceptual move. Instead of talking about dissonance as some sort of abstract generality, he says, no, let's break it down and talk about it at the level of a note. He says, and a dissonant note is a note that must be followed by another note, right? It's a note in search of resolution, right? Okay. So Schoenberg's famous emancipation of the dissonance is literally to use a note that should be followed by another note and don't follow it by one, okay? And then you realize that in a lot of ways, tonal music is constantly activating that sort of little Fort Da game, right? And there's two, so to me, Just Friends, that old standard song that, Bird played and all that on that Cecil record, it's like, yeah, you're what you're dealing with constantly is you're dealing with the tension of this deferral, right? Who talks about this in terms of melodrama and in terms of this sort of complex, that way in which the deferral, of resolution turns into a kind of suspense, right? Okay. That deferral of resolution is also the deferral of freedom, right? The deferral of that arrival, okay? The deferral of Jubilee, right? It's like, you know, they finally just go ahead and say, look, Harriet, we just gonna buy you and then give you to yourself. And she's pissed, right? You've taken away my victory, right? Because the resolution came, and at that moment, it was the confirmation of her status as a slave because she had resisted heretofore being bought and sold. But once she got bought and sold, even if it was to give her to herself, right, her enslavement was confirmed, right? So the resolution is tragic on some level, right? Okay, but so you defer it as long as possible, right? And popular music is very much interested in these. Like, to me, you know, I'm actually thinking of, you know, rest in peace, Linda Williams, and her book Playing the Race Card, which has some things about it that I kind of disagree with, but the whole analysis of racial melodrama is really interesting, right? And she, in this, sorry, I ain't forgot, but she says this thing, you know, it's like, so that the whole point of like the dramatizations of Uncle Tom's Cabin is like this feeling of release when somebody is rescued just in the nick of time. And one of the greatest songs, right, in the history of the working out of this whole problematic of deferred resolution is Bonnie Raitt's Nick of Time. And if you listen to it, right, the chords, it's like, you know, by the time you get to the end of that song, you get to that final sort of down resolution, and you go, whew, you know, it came just in the love. I found love just in the nick of time. I found resolution just in the nick of time. Okay. And who would ever deny oppressed people resolution? Freedom, right? You see what I'm like? You'd have to be a monster, right? Okay. But the problem, of course, is that at the same time as you'd have to be a monster to deny people resolution, you also have to be a monster to continue to produce the continual delusion that there is such a fucking thing. Right. Okay. So what's at stake is this double brutality. The imposition of resolution as a norm when it's impossible, and then the denial, not so much of resolution, but the denial of the right to dream of it. Okay. And then you get these musicians who are basically like, fuck it, right? I'm not in that anyway, okay? And so, I only ever made one PowerPoint. and I'll send it to y'all if you want to see it, but it's I read this really, I think, great book. A lot of people were mad at it, called The Half Has Never Been Told. This historian, Edward Baptist. And it's about what he calls second slavery, this sort of regime of slavery in the western part of the American South, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, Louisiana, and then the rise of, you know, the cotton, you know, economy. And one of the things he does is the chapters of the books are broken up by parts of the body. So there's arm, hand, feet, you know. He talks at one point about, he recognizes that it's a labor regime that is predicated on torture, right? That's how you, that productivity is ensured through torture. And so under that regime, you get this sort of almost mechanization, right, of the enslaved body. And it operates in two ways. One is just extraordinary speed, right? So he quotes Solomon Northup, but he also quotes Olmsted. It says, you see people picking cotton and their hands would be moving so fast it would be in a blur, right? And you think it's this complicated thing of like, you got to move your feet as you go down the long, hard-ass row, and your hands are moving at a blur, okay? It's independence of limbs, right? Which is important for drummers and pianists, okay? Right? Like, you know, the trap set, the word evidently comes from contraption. It's a machine, right? That it seems to me has the picking of cotton or the cutting of cane encoded in it. Okay? What the trap set allows for is a single person to play polyrhythms. So it also bears the trace of this brutal individuation that was given in the slave regime, okay? In which, you know, as an individual unit of labor, you were responsible for a certain quota of cotton, and anything that you did to undermine that. So right, this is brutal double edge. The black person can't be an individual, but the black person is placed under the absolute imperative of individuation, right? So it seems to me that the music is not, the music doesn't ameliorate this. The music doesn't turn this, doesn't, you see what I mean? It doesn't make up for this. It's not compensation for it. It bears that, right? Like you hear all that, right? You hear all that in the music. And so that's my long-winded way of saying what the music does do, okay? It doesn't resolve this. It doesn't turn it into a happy story. But what it does do is it actively practices irresolution, okay? It makes an active, practical claim on irresolution and displacement, okay? And that's, and you can see it the way when Max Roach is sitting at the at the drum kit, or when Cecil or when Andrew Hill is sitting at the piano, right? And the sonic effect of it is palimpsestic, right? It's this tremendously beautiful kind of overlay, you know? The painterly equivalent of it is Jack Whitten, right? You're like, oh, what do you do, man? I apply pigment to a surface, okay? Well, what are you doing? I'm painting over the paint, because the minute you apply pigment to the surface, the pigment becomes a surface, right? And so that's where you get, so depth in Jack Whitten isn't like a pictorial illusion of space, of spatial depth. Depth in Jack Whitten is like is depth in the surface, right? Like Jack Whitten's surfaces are deep, right? So, and it's the same with, with Cecil, so.
Hi, Fred. I'm also from Las Vegas. We met one time at a BAM event, and I think we were both grieving at the time, and you were sort of talking and very vulnerably about your writing, and that has always stuck with me. And I was like a grad student at the time. Now I'm a professor, and I'm like, wow, there's this full circle thing that feels like it's happening with you being here. So just sort of staying along the lines of the sonic inquiry, thinking about the ideas through sound. You mentioned earlier indeterminacy, and I guess I'm interested in your delivery. I think that you do an amazing work with the ways in which you're able to string together theories, ideas, writing, musicians. And I was thinking about Black Thought, the rapper, the hip hop artist, and his ability to freestyle. It's like he has acquired all of these thoughts, these phrases, these moments, and they're just there, ready, for him to be open enough, maybe, for them to sort of be called into existence. And your delivery strikes me as a sort of calling up, like in the way that the best freestylers are able to do. And everyone's like, where did that come from? And that connection gets made, and that connection gets made, and then there's a punchline, you know? And not to minimize, you know, how much effort which you are making appear to be effortless, you know? So I'm just curious about your delivery. Like, what is happening for you as you're moving through your ideas when you're delivering?
Thank you. I have a really good friend who lives in San Jose named Manolo Callahan. And he's one of the founding figures in this thing called the Center for Convivial Research and Autonomy. And we were talking last weekend, because he came up to New York with his comrade, our comrade, Ani Paradise. And we were talking about, I want there to be a distinction between storytelling and narrative. I don't know if there is, but I want there to be one, you know? And we were saying, so there's that great line, Benjamin, you were talking about this day, Baraka in that poem, he says, if you know, what happens if you come over here and they take away your boom, boom? Says, if they take away your boom, boom, you're in trouble. It might take you 400 years to get out of it, right? Some of also what is taken away are stories, okay? And one modality of taking away stories is, I guess, if there is, in my mind, the distinction between a story and narrative is that there's a developmental arc in narrative and a kind of imposition of implantment in narrative that is not necessarily always there in stories. And okay, so my mom came from this little town called Kingsland, Arkansas. And the next town over that she went to high school with was in Fordyce, Arkansas. And her best friends were from Fordyce. She went to high school with them, and they ended up living around the corner from us in Vegas. Like, my address is 401 Rico. If you go to D Street and Lake Mead, right? Lake Mead is the border from Las Vegas to North Las Vegas. And across Lake Mead, D Street turns into Inglestead. The next street past Inglestead is Rico, and that's where I live. They lived on D, 1948 North D. We used to have dinner with them every Sunday. And what it really was like a jam session for the telling of stories. And it was, you know, it was like being in a band. And the stories, you know, the repertoire was in a certain sense limited. We knew, you know, it wouldn't take very long for there was a good chance that the story that you heard 3 weeks ago, you were gonna hear it again this Sunday. But it was totally different. The features were different, right? And one of the weird, beautiful effects of these stories was that there were people that they would be talking about who died in 1937, and I can see them right now in my mind walking down the street in Arkansas. Right? Like, later, when I went to graduate school at Berkeley, one of my mentors was great literary critic and linguist Anne Banfield. And she taught us how to make a distinction between sentences of narration and sentences of description. And maybe one way to think about storytelling is that it is replete with description, right? And maybe a little bit more loose when it comes to narration. Maybe that's it, right? So all I'm saying is like, what I brought up in like a laboratory, right? Like it was like being in AACM, you know, right? Like, or like these people that I grew up around, the kids on the street, like it was like my neighborhood was like Juilliard for storytelling. You see what I'm saying, right? Like it was just and people valued it, you know, right? Like it was a thing. You might not be able to play basketball, but you know, like the most feared guy in my neighborhood was not the Hamptons could fight. And you couldn't mess with a Hampton because if you fought one Hampton, you had to fight 9 Hamptons. They had a kid in every year of school, right? But the guy that nobody messed with was this dude named Leslie, right? Leslie, because he could talk about people, right? Okay. So we would go to church. My mom did a lot of politics and stuff, and she would go to church. And but once you get, you know, as a young man, you get about 14, and then you sort of subtly were granted, without anybody ever saying so, permission to be outside. You had to be at church, but you didn't have to go in church. But you had to be in the proximity of church, right? And Leslie would be there, and so this whole delicate choreography would ensue in which a circle would be drawn around Leslie. And what you wanted to do was to be close enough to hear him talk about somebody, but far enough back so that he didn't catch you. Because if you caught his eye, it'd be 45 minutes of Leslie, you know. Like one time I caught a glancing blow of Leslie, and I just, you know. So do you understand what I'm saying? It's like I went to school for it. You know, and then later I went to college in graduate school, but I was in school for that, you know, and let me just say this. I don't think I can do shit that other people can't do. But the one thing I don't know, you know, I think it's a really great thing to be raised up by people who, man, you know, these women who raised me, they loved me, you know? Like they did. They gave me like reservoirs of confidence that have not been dried up. So what it means is even when I have no right to actually believe that I can do some shit, they told me that I could do stuff, so I can do stuff. But it's not that what I can do is something that you can't do. It's just, you know, I'm sorry, I'm just blathering. Actually, I was going to read y'all a poem, just because it's connected to this. But now I got to get my other. I'm like Fred. I'm not Fred Moten, I'm like Fred Sanford. I got so many pair of glasses and shit. Let's see if I can find. It's just a little. I have a way with words, and I let it have its way with me. I wave with words, and I ain't that particular. It's some graphic, predicative sluttiness to me, and that's okay with me. For me, I'm easy, ain't no slur on Sunday morning, but let me pray on it. You know?
Thank you. Hey, Fred, get back up here. here. You have to bask in this. Thank you so much.